This morning, Eva will bring us the reading from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41.
When evening came, Jesus said to the disciples, "Let's go over the other side of the lake." They left the crowd behind, and they took him along a boat, just as he was. There was also other boats with him. A wild storm came up. Waves crashed over the boat. It was just about to sink when Jesus, in the dark black, sleeping in a cushion. The disciples woke him up. They said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up and ordered the wind to stop. He said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." The wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Don't you have any faith at all yet?" They were terrified. They asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
I used to own a sailboat, and I noticed an interesting thing. Everybody has a different level of comfort with the sea. Now, some people would join me for a sail, and they would be completely unfazed by whatever the conditions were, whether the wind was fetching, the waves were piling up on the south shore of Lake Ontario, or whether it was nice and calm. Some people would be perfectly at ease, and other people would practically levitate off the surface of the boat when the slightest swell crossed the bow. Now, maybe you've had a bad experience, or maybe you just don't like sailing, I suppose. Or maybe you don't know how to interpret what it is that you're seeing. Everybody's different. Now, experience helps, of course. If you've been out on boats a lot, you may be a little more comfortable. But what would really help is if you were a professional. And so in the story that Eva read for us this morning, I find it really interesting. There's a couple things in the story that I find intriguing. The first one is how worried the disciples were. Now, Peter, Andrew, James, and John were professional fishermen. They had spent literally years on boats on the Lake of Galilee. It would be hard to get them unsettled on the water, day or night. And so it had to have been a fierce storm if you had them at wit's end. And that appears to be what's happened. You see, Mark is a friend of Peter. And Mark, telling us this story, tells us that a great wind or a gale struck, and the waves were overwhelming the boat. The type of sailing vessels that the disciples would have had a bow that would have had a prominence on the front. You would aim that into the waves to just get the waves to break to the sides. You don't want to get hit from the side. And so you'd have oars, and you would work the oars and keep the bow pointed forward, and it would be fine. Matthew tells the exact same story in Matthew chapter 8. And it's interesting because he uses different words. Now, Matthew sometimes quotes Mark verbatim, but here in this particular story, he uses words that are entirely his own. Matthew, not a fisherman, says that a great storm on the sea struck and the waves overwhelmed them. Literally in the Greek, he says a megas seismos, a huge quake. So like a sea quake struck the boat. Someone who likely was not very comfortable around the water. Now, before long, the fishermen have gotten worried. They're nervous. It must have been alarming in this boat as the waves are coming over and the water's starting to fill up. Then a second thing happens in this story that I find curious. It's Jesus' response. You see, Jesus is at the back of the boat where there's a cushion. He's curled up and he's asleep. He's still asleep in the midst of this storm with the waves crashing over the sides of the boat and with the disciples' instructions being shouted from one side of the boat to the other. It must have been a tremendous racket. And it's in the dark, no less. There's no navigational lights. There's no torches that are still lit. There's no lights on the shore that can be navigated by. It's pitch black. And you're being tossed up and down in this boat, navigated by feel alone. There are no safety lights. There's no light on the horizon. Master, don't you care that we're about to die? Now, storms come and go in different forms, and we've all felt the waves of COVID in one way or another in the past year. Maybe you're finding a way to work at home with your kids still at home. Maybe you've turned your dining room table into a workspace or installed a lock on your bedroom closet so that you can get some peace and quiet, or you can at least make some phone calls. No two families have had the same experience through this storm. No two families have felt the same pain. In some respects, we're in this all by ourselves, and it's difficult sometimes for us to appreciate what it's like for somebody else. For some of us, this storm has cost us tens of thousands of dollars, while others of us, nothing. Some of you have seen your whole livelihoods threatened. Your careers have been turned upside down. Some of you have seen your businesses suffer, and you're wondering whether you're even going to be able to survive. Or maybe your storm has had darker dimensions to it. Saying goodbye to a loved one, or worse, losing a loved one and not being able to properly say goodbye. I've watched with joy and with wonder as some of you have finally gotten to see grandkids or grandparents for the first time in months or even a year. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. Our pandemic experience has been filled with thunderstorms of emotion and doubt, with chants of howling winds of fear and depression and anxiety. And I'm afraid that many of us have not spent the time we need to reflecting on the trauma that's been borne out in our bodies, in our congregations, and in our families. We've lost so many marriages. We've lost so much time. We've spent so much time at the bottom of our own personal wells of despair. We've never been more disconnected as a church than we are right now. Have you spent time wondering in the past 16 months if Jesus is even aware of the challenge of this season? Master, don't you care that we're drowning here? Don't you see how much we've suffered? Now, the disciples finally leap to the back of the boat and shake Jesus until he's awake. And Jesus responds in a way that's is shaking in and of itself. Jesus first stands up and he scolds the wind, and he tells the waves to calm down. And they do. The voice that called them out of nothing at the beginning of time addresses them, and they respond instantly. It's difficult to imagine what's more terrifying, the storm or the fact that somebody in your boat just stood up, told the wind to be quiet, and it stopped immediately. The dark night returns to calm. But look in verse 40. Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Why are you so timid?" in the NIV. "Why are you so afraid?" in the NIV. How is it that you still have no faith? Why am I afraid? Jesus, the boat is half full of water. We can barely keep the bow pointed. We're exhausted from the effort. Matthew's over there in the corner having kittens. I don't know how he's ever going to recover. You act like being afraid's the wrong answer. That's the only correct answer. How could I not be afraid? There are churches bigger than our church that are closing over the summer this year. I have friends in Texas that are closing their churches, and this storm is to blame. Our family has suffered many losses, and some of us are hanging on by a thread. Some of us feel overwhelmed with the changes that we're being asked to accept. The water is right at the gunnels, and it feels like one more wave is just going to take us under. How can Jesus be so disconnected from reality, we think? Why is he surprised that the disciples are afraid? Or is something else at work in the story? I guess the question is, should they have woken Jesus up? Or should they have perhaps woken him up sooner? Is Jesus saying to them that they woke him up too early, or is it too late? Is Jesus saying, you didn't need to wake me up, all you needed was faith. Just have faith. Do you seriously think that I, the Son of God, came to earth only to drown in a freak storm? Or is Jesus instead saying that they waited too long? The disciples had seen Jesus cast out demons. They had seen him cure the blind and the lame. Nothing seemed beyond his grasp, and yet they exhaust themselves keeping the boat upright, working against the wind and the waves. They've seen Jesus do miracles, but they just don't feel like his power needs to work in their lives. Do they think that Jesus can't calm a storm? Or are they perhaps worried that he won't? For all the struggles that we've experienced over this past year and a bit, how many of them have we borne alone? How many of them have we spent struggling at the oars, seemingly unwilling to wake the master while we handle our own problems? When the reality of injustice and racism begins to dawn on us like it has with the residential school crisis, have we lifted up this grievous sin to God in prayer? Or have we sat and worry and stew about it instead? Have we asked God for his wisdom? Or have we blistered our hands at the oars? Are we worried that Jesus can't help us with racism? Or our parenting challenges? Or our financial distress, or our marriage challenges? Or are we worried that Jesus just won't? Is it a lack of courage, or is it a lack of faith? The gospel for us this morning, the good news of Mark chapter 4, is that Jesus can and that Jesus will. That Jesus can calm storms in our life and that Jesus will calm storms in our life. Jesus cares and Jesus will help. Our faith doesn't bear us through our challenges by our own strength. We don't prove our worthiness by how hard we're willing to fight the storm. Our faith draws us to Jesus, and Jesus carries us through. Our lack of faith is not how much we struggle. Our lack of faith is seen in how reluctant we are to invite Jesus into our trouble. This is the part that I have found so refreshing about our practice of praying Scripture. Occasionally, by taking a text and reading a text and then praying that text, it has stimulated in me prayers that I needed to pray to God that I just didn't know I needed. It's given me the words to pray prayers that I haven't known how to say. And that's why it's been such a useful and worthwhile practice for me. As we sing this next song together, I invite you to reflect. Are there things that you've held back and not asked Jesus for his help? Are there ways that we can carry the struggles that we are genuinely worried about right now and bring them to God in prayer? After all, the one who calms the sea and the storm is Jesus. It's the Son of God who loves us and cares for us and is sitting in the back of our boats waiting for us.